Welcome to the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. This is a podcast about our relationship with food and eating, body image, eating disorder recovery, mental health, and more. I am your host, Lynn Thorstensen, a registered nutrition therapist and body image coach based in the west of Ireland. And I'm so glad that you're here. So today I wanted to talk about a topic that has come up a good bit in my clinic recently, and I thought that it might be worth exploring this with you here. And of course, what I'm talking about is it time to break up with the scales, and what is your lived experience and your relationship to the scales currently, and of course, what would you like it to be? And if you have listened to my own recovery journey, my own lived experience, you will know that getting off the scales was one of the big moments for me. And really, I think what initially set me on the path to recovery and food freedom. Of course, it's not like it wasn't the only thing. And I think even today, it's an ongoing journey because, as you know, we live in a culture that values thinness over pretty much everything else. And diet cultures everywhere. So, it's an ongoing journey to sort of navigate that through and to be true to ourselves. But I think, exploring our relationship with the scales is a big part of this journey. And it looks a bit different for everyone. But, it's worth something, it's worth thinking about, particularly if you are somebody who is currently weighing yourself. Could be daily, could be multiple times a day, it could be a few times a week, once a week, and it just feels kind of difficult to navigate. And even if you're not ready to step away from it altogether at this point, then I'm hoping that today's conversation, monologue, solo episode will make you think a little bit about what you would like and what might be possible. And in my work with people, this particular topic is almost always in the room, but it doesn't always come up early on in the journey. But sometimes it does. And I always ask people on an exploration call before we decide if this is a good fit, what would it be like to put weight loss on the back burner or put it to the side and not focus so much on intentionally pursuing it? And of course, if we're not doing that, it's kind of helpful to not constantly weighing yourself because, it will interfere with the process. But again, it doesn't mean that you can't start on this work, even if you are simultaneously weighing yourself, because that also gives a good opportunity to explore what is it you're looking for when you get on the scales. And that's something that I do want to talk about today. But, there's so many things to often pull on to explore in the recovery process that sometimes this isn't the most pressing topic, and sometimes it is. And I think weighing ourselves really is this innate part of dieting. It's like, do you diet? I mean, if you don't step on the scales, there's other ways to measure, as you know, like you can measure by clothes, you can measure with a measuring tape, you can use calipers. There is loads of things, loads of ways that we can measure our bodies. But one of the most common ones, of course, is to step on a scales. And that's like, wherever you go, even in our current apartment that, we rent, there's the scales in the bathroom. It doesn't belong to me, it doesn't belong to my partner, so I'm a bit reluctant to throw it out, but I never use it, and I don't think my partner does either. But the thing is, we learn through diet culture, and often, this isn't uncommon that I've heard stories, the first time people got on the scales was when they were 5 or 10, or somebody told them that, their body was a problem and they need to lose weight, or they're getting too big, or they were being weighed in the doctor's office or weighed at school and comments were made. So diet culture teaches us through this that our worth is tied to our weight. And if our worth is tied to our weight, then of course we need to keep an eye on it, because it makes sense. We want to be worthy, we want to belong, we want to be appreciated, loved, right? And micromanaging or measuring and controlling our weight can then become a full-time job in and of itself. And it becomes this thing that we hand over so much of our own innate power onto this kind of inanimate object. And I'm probably going to go around in circles here, but one of my clients said recently, when we were reflecting on this, was like, when you step out of it, it just doesn't make sense. It's just a number. It's like our bodies aren't, meat that we weigh and we pay for. Like, you're going to, say, the butcher or to the supermarket and get X pounds of minced meat or X pounds of fruit or berries or whatever it is you're buying. It's like, they aren't just a piece of meat, right? So why are we so fixated on this number, right? And again, I think this is a bigger question to think about for ourselves. There is this thing, of course, that we've learned, that our weight is tied to our worth. And we kind of have to figure that out for ourselves. Well, what does that mean? And if I let this go, what does that mean? And for myself, I think one of the things that I noticed, and I probably mentioned this in my own journey, which is the first episode of the very first episode in season 1. But I remember thinking that I'd get on the scales and I had this arbitrary number in my head that I always wanted to get to, which was some kind of number that I weighed, like, I suppose, early puberty or something. Like, it was just completely unattainable for what my body wanted to be, and it would cost me a lot of effort and work and sacrifices and a lot of hunger to try to get there, and it wasn't possible to stay there anyway. But I would think, like, okay, if I weigh this, then I'm going to be happy. And that was kind of the questions. And then I would get on to the scales and it would show close to that number, and that would feel good because that meant I was, on track, whatever that means. But then the number wasn't getting closer to this arbitrary number that I had in my head. It was getting further away from that number. And I was like the shame of that. And I think that didn't help with my eating, because then it was kind of like, what's the point? And I might as well carry on. And I was also hungry because my eating was all over the place. But you can possibly relate to this, that when you get on the scales and it shows a smaller number, or like that things are decreasing, that there is a sense of a thrill or a dopamine hit to that. And, why wouldn't you want more of that? And that's something that I hear a lot from clients who, have been weighing themselves in the past, or, and that can happen the very first time you go on a diet and you lose weight, and it's like, oh, the thrill of it. And maybe that is the one time that your body is complying, and then after that, it will never comply with that. And the other thing is, which is also really common, and maybe you can relate to this as well, is that people often say, oh, they look back in photos and say, well, I was thin then, and I wish I was that size now, but I remember that I wasn't particularly happy then. Or for other people, it might be more like that, you get praise as you're losing weight, and then you lose some more weight, and that's great, and then you lose some more weight, and then all of a sudden people are saying, well, don't lose any more because you don't look good now, and that's concerning. And even if you're thinking, actually, I don't want to lose any more weight, eating has become really difficult. That can also happen. And I think the problem is, this is not what we're told when we start out, is that we're looking for happiness and validation in an illusion. We're looking at it from an external place, and we're also now handing it over to this metal piece with a gauge inside of it that is just measuring our gravity when we're saying, oh, I'm just going to be happy when I get to this number. Then I can allow myself, and then I'm going to do these things. It's an illusion. That's not where the happiness comes from, or the freedom or the sense of validation comes from. It's an inside job. But, that wouldn't make the diet industry billions of dollars if we all kind of felt quite good enough and worthy inside. So I think it's important to think about that too, that, where did we learn these things? I think it always comes back to that. It's like, where did I learn that my worthiness was tied to my body? Was it from people, from society, from magazines, from movies? Probably all of them. And is that congruent with my current values? And if not, then why am I still adhering to this other stuff? And if it is, well and good. But also often, and this was another conversation I had with somebody recently, is like, for most people, you cannot have a body that is at a size that it doesn't want to be. And that might happen to be in what society deems as beautiful or compliant or acceptable, without there being really, really high costs to it. But the other thing, though, of course, is that maybe you're somebody who's been recovering from a restrictive eating disorder and you've gained weight and you've been smaller. And gosh, I know like there's so much hard work that goes into accepting and allowing for that to happen. But you might get to a place where it's like, okay, that should be enough now. No more. Or you've lost weight and you've managed to keep it off for a good long period because you're checking in, you're keeping things in check by getting on the scales in a regular intervals and, trying to control things. And again, is this working for you? Is the costs and benefits is the benefits outweighing the costs? And maybe they are, and that's fine. And maybe they're not. And the thing as well is when we're trying to control food and weight, it functions like a really good distraction. And especially if there's other things in your life that may feel like they're outside your control. This can also be a reason why we start a diet or pursue intentional weight loss in the first place. Because food and our bodies are real tangible things. Whereas relationship issues, emotional turmoil, anxiety, stress, overwhelm, issues at work, not feeling appreciated or underpaid or, whatever it is, that they're not tangible things. You can't see them. You can't grab them. They're much more nebulous than that. So it's easy, I should say, to project those feelings of overwhelm and out of control onto our bodies, and that is something that's tangible, that gives us that sense of agency. But the thing is that, again, this is another illusion, because our bodies are governed by physiological and biological needs, and they will do what they need to do in order to try and meet those needs, because their job is to try to keep us alive. And I'm going to link to another article in the show notes that I came across as well, that was looking at and explaining why people can gain weight or maintain weight even when they're eating very little. And then, of course, another alongside that, which is something that I covered a little bit with when I spoke with Lynn McGovern. We talked about orthorexia, but we also talked about atypical anorexia, which is when people in larger bodies are having a restrictive eating disorder, restrictive eating patterns. They may lose weight actually dramatically, but the person is exhibiting all the same symptoms and behaviors, including physiological symptoms and side effects of malnutrition and malnourishment and from under eating, but their weight is still above the weight criteria for anorexia. Some people call atypical anorexia anorexia with weight stigma, which is, I think, very much closer to the truth. So that's all of there. So the thing that we have this idea that we're sold, that we can control our bodies and they will stay the same if we do the all the things. And actually, there's not even a guarantee of that, because your body's job is to keep you alive. So let that sink in for a while. And, if you're weighing yourself, so there's it feels good if the scales drop, it feels, less positive or bad, I should say maybe, or, terrible, out of control if you're gaining weight. And I suppose, again, it's to decouple the number from the scales. It's just a number on the scales. The other stuff is narratives that we put on. That's the meaning we're making of these numbers and these changes. The number is just a number. It's just measuring your gravity against the ground. But often two things happens, right? And if the number doesn't show what we expect it to show, either if it's gone up, you might find yourself restricting more, starting a new diet, or you might further increase your exercise, or what used to happen to me, it's like, what's the point? Pick this. And because you're probably hungry anyway, if you've been restricting leading up to this weigh-in, is that I will just eat more, I'll just binge, whatever, because what's the point? None of this, it's like, so it just swings the other way. And neither of these approaches, whether you're increasing this restriction or exercising more or tightening things up, or you're just letting it all go to hell, is moving you towards a place of feeling more at peace with food and with your body and yourself. And then something that came up for one of my clients recently was that, they've taken a bit of hiatus from weighing themselves whilst we've been working together, finding a better relationship with food, eating more regularly, finding ways to move their body that feels really nourishing and joyful instead of punishing. And this person done incredible work in exploring all of these things. And of course, there's still desire for weight loss. And after some of the months of they've sort of really doing this and feeling good in themselves with food and their self-care, and they had this sense of, I'm feeling lighter. And I don't think they'd weighed themselves for quite a number of weeks. And this is something that came up. So then I was like, well, I'm feeling really good. I'm pretty sure I've lost some weight. And this again is something that I used to see way back when I was working still with, I don't know, what do you call it, healthy weight loss, that people would have been taking good care of themselves throughout the week. They were eating foods that they enjoy. They were maybe even eating some more. They've been exercising. They were moving. Sleep was feeling good because their blood sugar was better. All of those things. And they felt really good. And they would say all of those things to me. And then they would get on the scales. And if it hadn't budged, or worse, they'd put on a pound, it was like none of those things mattered. All the benefits from taking good care of themselves and their bodies, it was like, it doesn't matter. There's no point. Or what am I doing wrong? Right? And this is kind of we have to think about decoupling these things. But for my clients, what happened was they got on the scales and they noticed the weight hasn't changed. It has stayed the same. It stabilized from where they were. And there was a few things that came up that we explored together, And this was one of the big things, was the realization that maybe I don't need the scales to tell me how I'm feeling. Yeah, maybe I don't need that. Because maybe I know what it feels like when I'm nourishing myself with foods that is satisfying. I know what feels good when it comes to moving my body and building a relationship with movement that is something that they want to be doing and that they can sustain, and that there's a level of flexibility within. And I just thought that was such a revelation. And it actually reminded me a lot of, I think, one of like the pivot moment that I had in my own relationship with scales was that, well, maybe I can actually feel happy regardless. Maybe that this isn't the place. So for my client, it was that they really realized that they're creating ways of daily self-care that take care of their body regardless of what it looks like and what they weigh. And we talked about that, like decoupling the number of the scales and that being sort of an indicator of things, how things are going, versus their internal experience, which is what's kind of prompted them to get on the scale in the first place. I just thought it was so interesting. And from this conversation, they kind of realized that maybe the scales are redundant. Maybe it's time to let it go. Maybe the motivation for self-care is becoming much more intrinsic, and that it's not built on validation from this inanimate object that it actually, as it turns out, is only measuring one's force of gravity. It's not measuring your worth, your worthiness, your health, or any of those things. And again, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, is that when we were sitting together in this conversation and we're zooming out and looking at it, the whole thing a bit more objectively, that there was really this sense of absurdity about weighing one's body. Like this piece of meat being weighed out for some consumption or something. I don't know, there was really an energy of kind of, this thing is a bit absurd. Like why? And I think it takes time, right? It took time, even for myself. Like I had already started doing certain things, I think, before I was ready to let go of the scales. And it's not easy to let go of it if it feels that it's giving you a sense of control. Often it feels like that if I let go of controlling my body and weight and using the scales as this kind of check-in measurement point, that my weight and my body would just like balloon out of all proportions. Like, however, it's not really true. And the thing is, as well, is like, if we're having something that we're using externally outside of ourselves to keep track and to check, it's difficult to establish real trust between ourselves and our bodies, and trusting that our bodies know what to do. They know what to do with food. They know how to take care of us, and our job is to take care of our bodies. It's a reciprocal relationship, and I really believe that. Because it's really rare that body weight just changes dramatically. And if it changes dramatically, something is probably going on. And in my experience, people are worried most about their bodies ballooning out of all proportions are the ones that have the tightest control, and are probably less likely that their bodies are going to turn into out of control. And I think within that, and this is what something that another one of my guests from earlier in this season, Anna Strickland, talked about. She said, I really had to think about loving my body, not just as it is, but what if it was bigger? What if it was 5 times bigger? Could I love myself then? And if not, why not? Because then we're circling back to our internalized weight bias, anti-fat bias, right? And that's hard. And I think that's something that most of us who've grown up in diet culture will have to keep chipping away at for our whole life. But, you know, we can, like, and again, scales are a bit like other fitness trackers, devices. They can work, but if it's starting to control you rather than, giving a sense of awareness and gathering some data, but it starts feeling obsessive and controlling and rigid, then, in the end of the day, your body knows what to do, and our job is to listen. And it's difficult to listen when we have something outside of ourselves that are telling us what we should do. And there can be times when I think they're useful, but also at some point, how do we establish that trust within ourselves? But all of this said, of course, is I do believe that you can begin to work on regular, adequate eating and attunement way before you let go of the scales. And in fact, actually, sometimes I think that's really important to do that first, because then, like with this client, it just sort of becomes redundant in and of itself. So, I do want to say that, like, don't feel like, oh God, I have to let go of the scales before I can start doing other types of recovery work. No. And again, it's a bit like with structured eating. Structured eating is super helpful in order to build consistency and adequate eating and making sure your body and brain gets adequately nourished over time. And from there, we can still explore like hunger and fullness cues, even if there's more of a structure in place. It doesn't mean that you can't become an attuned eater. It's just we're building the flexibility within a scaffolding. And yeah, finally, I think doing this work again, coming back to like decoupling weight and health and weight from worth is so important. So that, and then building the trust within ourselves and the reciprocal relationship between ourselves and our bodies, so that we can just leave these tracking devices and the scales as modes of controlling, because it's something that's outside of ourselves. And again, of course, it has to be said that all of this often is easier for those of us who are in smaller bodies, because we only have to undo a lot of our own internalized anti-fat bias, rather than for people who live in larger bodies that always have to contend with the anti-fat bias in the external world. That's just unfortunately how it is, and I think it's important to recognize that. But as we come to an end for this episode, this solo episode, I want to leave you with a couple of questions to ponder. And I'm hoping that this thinking around breaking up with the scales has been useful. So here goes. What is your current relationship with the scales? How often do you weigh yourself? And how do you feel before you get on the scales, while you're on them, and afterwards? And how also does that impact your eating or movement behaviors or rest or any other things in your life? I can think that's quite important, because how does this spill in to your life? If you can get on the scales, you check a number and you're like, okay, that's what it is, and you just get on with your day, well, fine, it doesn't have an impact. But for a lot of people, it does have an impact. And for me, it had so much impact that I had to stop. And, if you have been able to parse it out and you're not weighing yourself religiously, daily, weekly, whatever, then when you have a desire to get on the scales, what are you noticing? What is it you're looking for? What is the draw? What is it you're hoping to find? Right? Can we get curious about all of that? And I do want to leave you. And if this is something that you're looking for some support to navigate all of it, then, please feel free to book in to no obligations 30-minute sessions, just to see if we're a good fit and to explore a bit more about what this work can look like working together. Because again, for me, it's always trying to meet you where you're at, and the journey looks slightly different for everybody. So, yeah, if that's something you're interested in, then let me know. But again, thank you for listening, and feel free to share this with anybody who you think might be benefiting. See you soon. Thanks for listening. The Joyful Nourishment podcast is produced with no financial backing, and your support means a lot to keep this project going. If this episode has been helpful in any way, please consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. This helps the podcast to be found by others. And of course, you can also forward this episode to a friend whom you think may benefit. Find out more about what I offer on straightforwardnutrition.com, and if you're interested in working with me, please use the link in the show notes to book in for a free initial 30-minute session. And finally, please come and join the Joyful Nourishment community over on Substack, unless you're there already, by subscribing to my newsletter using the link below.